I am Emily, 30 years old, and I never imagined that one ordinary evening in my parents' house would end with the sound of my ribs cracking beneath the force of a chair. My sister Veronica stood over me, her face twisted with rage, her hands clutching the heavy wooden dining chair she had just swung against my side. The impact had been so brutal that the world around me blurred. Pain exploded through my chest, sharp and suffocating, leaving me gasping for breath on the polished hardwood floor. I remember the metallic taste in my mouth, the dizzying whirl of fear, and the awful realization that my own sister had just crossed a line from cruelty into something that could very well have killed me. Yet what seared me even more than the pain was the sight of my father Robert standing in the doorway. He did not rush forward to stop her, nor did he shout an alarm or call for help. Instead, his lips curved into a smirk, a cruel upward twist that told me more clearly than words ever could that in his eyes I was nothing but a nuisance deserving of punishment. My ribs burned with every shallow breath, and I tried to curl away from Veronica's looming figure, but the agony was too much. My body refused to move, betrayed by broken bones and shock. I looked to my mother Margaret, who hovered nearby with her hands pressed to her mouth. For a fleeting second, I thought she would rush to me, finally protect me. But then she shook her head and whispered in a trembling voice that sliced through me like a knife. It was just an accident. Emily must have fallen. The world spun darker around me. Accident. That was the word they always used. From the time I was a child, every bruise, every cut, every humiliation at Veronica's hands had been softened and buried under that single lie. Accident. Now, with fire in my lungs and stabbing pain with every breath, that word was being forced upon me again, as if I had somehow tripped into the chair that shattered my ribs. Veronica dropped the chair with a thud that echoed like a gunshot, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. "Stop pretending," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You always want attention. Now you have it." I wanted to scream, to fight back, to expose her violence right there, but the pain was so immense that only a weak cry escaped my lips. My father's smirk deepened, and he finally spoke, his tone calm, almost amused. "We will deal with this at home," he said. Those words rang in my ears louder than Veronica's blow because I knew what they meant. Silence. Cover up. Denial. The rules of my family had always been clear. Protect Veronica at all costs, bury the truth, make Emily the problem. But as I lay broken on that floor, one thought forced itself through the haze of pain. This time the truth would not stay buried. This time evidence would speak louder than their lies. Before I go deeper into my story, I want to pause and ask you something important. Have you ever been in a situation where the very people who should have protected you instead turned their backs on you? Have you ever felt silenced by your own family, forced to swallow the truth just to keep the peace? If you have, then you already understand the fear and the loneliness that comes when the people closest to you become your greatest threat. I know many of you watching have faced struggles within your own families, and I want you to know you are not alone. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and if you have ever had to stand up against toxic relatives or walk away from a harmful family dynamic. Your words might give courage to someone else who feels trapped right now and is searching for hope. And if my story resonates with you even a little, do not forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding strength through painful truths. Sharing these experiences is how we break the silence together and how we remind each other that even in the darkest circumstances there is a way forward. I grew up in a house that looked like perfection from the outside, a stately colonial home in a quiet neighborhood in New Jersey where the lawns were trimmed like carpets and the neighbors waved politely as my father drove his gleaming car into the driveway each evening. To the community, my parents Robert and Margaret were the model of success. Robert was a respected attorney who carried himself with confidence and charm, while Margaret was the graceful hostess of social gatherings, always ready with a polished smile and stories of her talented elder daughter, Veronica. To outsiders, our family portrait was enviable, the kind of American prosperity people aspired to. But behind those pristine walls, the story was entirely different. From the time I was old enough to notice, there was a division drawn through our family like a line I could never cross. Veronica, 2 years older than me, was the golden child. She had my mother's caramel hair and my father's sharp cheekbones, and in their eyes, she could do no wrong. Straight A, grades, trophies from high school sports, admiration from teachers and relatives. Everything she touched was celebrated as brilliance. I was the younger daughter who never seemed to measure up. When I brought home a drawing from school, my mother praised Veronica's piano recital instead. When I scored well on a test, my father asked why I could not achieve consistently like Veronica. Every comparison left me smaller, every achievement erased by the shadow of my sister's glow. My earliest memory of the imbalance was when I was 6. I had spent days working on a solar system diorama for school. I painted each planet carefully, even adding glitter to Saturn's rings. The morning it was due, I found it smashed on my bedroom floor, planets crushed beyond repair. I cried and told my parents that Veronica had done it. My father barely glanced up from his newspaper and said it was my fault for leaving it out where it could be damaged. Margaret told me to learn to share, as if my hours of effort were a selfish indulgence. That lesson sank deep. In our home, Veronica was untouchable. When she borrowed my clothes without asking staining or tearing them, I was scolded for being possessive. When she threw tantrums that rattled the windows, hurling objects until she got her way, my mother excused it as passion, saying Veronica felt things deeply. Once, when I was 12, Veronica shoved me into a wall during an argument, leaving a bruise on my shoulder. I cried to my parents, but they called it normal sibling roughness. When I was asked to prom before Veronica, she slashed my dress with scissors. They replaced it with a new one, but no one addressed her violence. Over and over, I was told the same phrases. Do not provoke her. You know how to push her buttons. Sisters fight. That is just how it is. In truth, it was not about sibling rivalry. It was about power. Veronica had it, and my parents gave it to her freely while I lived in the role of scapegoat, blamed for the chaos she created. College was my escape. I chose a university in Boston, far enough to breathe but close enough to manage occasional family visits. Those years gave me the first taste of freedom. I made friends who valued me for who I was, including Sophie, who would later become one of the anchors that saved me. After graduation, I built a modest but independent life in the city, working as an editor at a small publishing company. For a time, I believed I had finally stepped out of Veronica's shadow. But life has a way of undoing fragile victories. Publishing was hit hard by layoffs, and as one of the newer employees, I was let go. Months of job searching drained my savings and my hope. When I could no longer afford rent, I faced the decision I dreaded most: returning to my parents' home. On the phone, Margaret's voice carried its familiar judgment as she said, "Of course you can come back. This house will always be here when things do not work out." The words cut sharper than she realized. I returned, telling myself it would be temporary, just long enough to find a new position and rebuild my savings. But I had underestimated how quickly old patterns would resurface. Veronica still lived at home, her gallery job cushioned by our father's connections, her life revolving around shopping brunches, and her boyfriend, Daniel. My return threatened the comfort she had carved out. She greeted me coldly, eyes narrowing as if I had invaded her territory. On my first night back, she cornered me in the kitchen and asked how long I planned to mooch off Mom and Dad. I forced a smile and said, just until I found another job, hoping to keep peace. She scoffed, "Good luck in this economy, maybe you should have chosen a more practical career." I swallowed the barb and retreated to my childhood bedroom, now converted into a sterile guest room stripped of every trace of my past. Days blurred into endless job applications and polite rejections. I avoided Veronica as much as possible, tiptoeing through the house like a guest in my own family. Yet even silence seemed to provoke her. If I cooked breakfast, she sneered about freeloaders. If I stayed out of the way, she accused me of sulking. The tension pressed heavier with each passing day. Then Daniel broke up with her 3 weeks after I returned. The breakup was the match that ignited everything. She stormed home, sobbing, mascara streaked down her face, throwing her purse so hard it knocked over a vase. Margaret rushed to console her, and Robert left work early to pour her wine and declare Daniel unworthy. They rallied around Veronica with outrage and sympathy, strategizing ways to win him back. Meanwhile, I sat invisible at the table, listening to them plot charity galas and phone calls to Daniel's family. I thought of all the times my heartbreaks had been brushed aside with cold advice like, "You will get over it," or "There are plenty of fish in the sea." For once, anger pushed through my silence. I spoke without thinking, maybe this is a pattern worth examining. 3 relationships have ended the same way, each man saying he felt suffocated. The room went silent, their eyes snapping toward me. Veronica's voice was quiet, dangerous, as she asked what exactly I was implying. My chest pounded, but I pressed on, saying maybe there was a reason her relationships kept collapsing. She accused me of jealousy. Robert told me to apologize. Margaret urged me to understand her feelings. I refused. I pushed my chair back and went upstairs, heart racing with the knowledge I had broken the unspoken rule: never challenge Veronica. The uneasy truce that had existed when I first returned home shattered completely after that night at the dinner table. I had dared to speak aloud what everyone else avoided, and it made me the enemy in my own house. Veronica's glare followed me in every room, her words sharp and poisonous whenever we crossed paths. My parents acted as though nothing unusual had happened, but I felt the tension simmering beneath the polished surface of our home. Margaret fussed over Veronica with increased intensity, bringing her tea and patting her shoulder while whispering comfort. Robert became more commanding toward me, reminding me each morning to keep the peace and not provoke my sister. Yet provoke was the word they used whenever I simply existed. I began to spend more time outside, searching for jobs from coffee shops, taking long walks to avoid the suffocating atmosphere of the house. But every return meant stepping back into a cage of resentment. Veronica's breakup with Daniel consumed the household. She wailed late into the night, slammed doors, and accused me of bringing bad energy into her life. She claimed Daniel would have stayed if I had not distracted the family with my problems. Margaret never corrected her. Robert never challenged her. Instead, they nodded sympathetically, feeding the narrative that I was the source of all misfortune. One evening, I overheard them in the living room, Margaret whispering that maybe I should consider staying with a friend until I got back on my feet. Robert agreed, saying my presence was clearly upsetting Veronica. My throat tightened with humiliation. I was their daughter too, yet they were plotting to send me away to preserve Veronica's comfort. That night, I called Sophie in tears, confessing that I felt like an intruder in my own family. She told me to hold on, that things would not always be this way, but her words could not erase the sting of being unwanted by the people who should have been my safest place. As the weeks passed, my job search produced some hopeful leads. I landed a promising interview with a publishing firm back in Boston. For the first time since moving home, I felt a flicker of hope. I spent the morning preparing, wearing my navy blouse, brushing my hair back neatly, trying to feel like the professional woman I had once been. The interview went well, and the manager ended with words that filled me with cautious optimism, saying my experience was exactly what they were looking for. My heart soared as I walked downstairs, eager to share the good news with Sophie over the phone. That was when the front door slammed. Veronica burst in, mascara streaked her purse flying onto the counter. She announced between sobs that Daniel had humiliated her by ending things in a public cafe. Margaret dropped everything to comfort her, and minutes later Robert arrived, called home urgently by my mother. The entire family mobilized as though tragedy had struck, surrounding Veronica with sympathy and promises of revenge against Daniel's supposed betrayal. I sat quietly at the table, pushing food around my plate, as they discussed ways to win him back. My father suggested reaching out to Daniel's family through professional connections. My mother proposed inviting him to an upcoming charity gala where Veronica could appear dazzling in a new dress. No one looked at me, no one asked about my day. My voice trembled with pent-up frustration as I finally spoke. Maybe Daniel left because he felt suffocated the same way Michael and David had before. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Veronica's eyes narrowed. Margaret's lips tightened. Robert's jaw clenched. Veronica whispered that I was jealous, accusing me of sabotaging her happiness because I could not manage my own life. Margaret urged me to apologize. Robert ordered me to take back my words. I refused. I stood up, heart-hammering, and said I would not apologize for speaking the truth. I retreated upstairs, shutting the door to my room with shaking hands. Downstairs, I heard Margaret murmuring soothing words to Veronica Robert, declaring that I was cruel. Veronica's angry voice cut through, promising she would make me regret humiliating her. Her words hung in the air like a threat. That night, I lay awake in the dark, every creak of the house sounding like footsteps outside my door. I thought about leaving packing my bags and running to Sophie's apartment, but pride and fear of admitting defeat held me back. I told myself I could endure a little longer until a job offer came. I underestimated Veronica's rage. The following evening, I crept to the hallway bathroom before bed. When I opened the door to return to my room, she was waiting. Her eyes were red, but no longer wet with tears. They burned with something colder, more dangerous. She leaned against the wall, her voice calm as she asked if I had enjoyed humiliating her at dinner. I tried to step past, but she blocked my way, accusing me of wanting attention, of trying to ruin her life. I told her to move, that I was not doing this tonight. She leaned closer, whispering, "Make me." I attempted to push past, but she grabbed my wrist and twisted until I cried out. Poor little Emily, always the victim she mocked. I yanked free and shoved her shoulder, not meaning to hurt her, only to escape. The look on her face shifted from surprise to pure fury. That was the moment I knew something terrible was about to happen. Veronica's fury erupted in a way I had never seen before. Her eyes flashed, and she seized the nearest object, the heavy wooden chair that stood by the hallway wall. Before I could move, before I could even process what she intended, she lifted it high and swung with a force that knocked the air from my lungs. The edge of the chair slammed against my side with a sickening crack, a sound I will never forget. White, hot pain shot through my chest, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping as if I were drowning on dry land. My hand instinctively clutched my ribs, and the searing agony told me something had broken. I tried to scream, but the sound came out as a strangled whimper. Veronica towered over me, breathing heavily, her hair wild around her face, her lips curled into a sneer. "You always wanted attention," she spat. "Now you have it." I writhed, struggling to shift away, but every breath was jagged and unbearable. At that moment, Robert appeared in the doorway. For a fleeting second, I thought he would rush to me, call for help, do something to stop the madness. Instead, he looked down at me and then at Veronica, and to my horror, a smirk crept across his face. He actually smirked as if this was the outcome he approved of. My chest burned, my vision blurred, and I forced out the words, "Help me, my risas." Margaret appeared behind him, her hand pressed against her mouth, eyes wide. She looked ready to run to me, but Robert's voice cut through the air, steady and commanding. "We will deal with this at home," he said. Those words pierced deeper than Veronica's blow. Margaret hesitated, then whispered, "Emily must have fallen. It was an accident." Her words twisted the truth as they always did. Accident, the lie that had covered every bruise of my childhood. Veronica dropped the chair with a thud and crossed her arms, her breathing slowing as though she had purged her rage. I tried to crawl toward the wall, but the pain stopped me cold. Robert walked over, crouched down, and looked into my eyes. "You will not speak of this outside these walls," he said in a low voice. "Do you understand me? If you do, everything will remain intact. If you do not, you will destroy this family." My head spun. I wanted to shout that it was already destroyed, but I could barely draw air. Margaret knelt awkwardly beside me, pressing a handkerchief into my trembling hand. "Put this on your ribs," she muttered, though it was useless against shattered bone. My body shook uncontrollably, not just from injury, but from the realization that no one would protect me, not even my parents. Veronica leaned down, her voice dripping with venom. "You always think you are the victim, but no one will believe you. They never have." I closed my eyes, praying for strength, tasting blood on my lips. The minutes blurred until Robert finally said he would drive me to the hospital, though not because of concern for me. His reasoning was simple. The neighbors might hear better to keep things discreet. Margaret stayed behind. He claimed to watch over Veronica, who apparently needed comfort more than I did. Every step to the car was torture. Robert half dragged me, scolding me under his breath to stop being dramatic. When I tried to cry out that Veronica had broken my ribs, he cut me off sharply. "Do not even think about saying that at the hospital, Emily. You tripped, you fell, end of story." I collapsed into the passenger seat, clutching my side as waves of pain washed over me. He drove in silence for a moment, then began rehearsing the cover story aloud, as if training me for an exam. You were rushing to answer the phone, you missed a step, and you fell against the chair. Simple accident, nothing more. I turned my head toward the window, tears streaming silently down my cheeks. Each bump in the road sent knives of pain through my ribs. Robert's words pounded in my ears. If you say anything else, you will ruin Veronica's future and bring shame on all of us. I knew then that his smirk had not been a fleeting reaction, it was the truth of who he was. He was not horrified, not even surprised. He was satisfied. At that moment, lying broken in the car, I realized that I had only two choices: remain silent as always and let them bury me under their lies, or finally find the courage to speak, even if it meant standing against my entire family. By the time Robert pulled into the hospital parking lot, every breath felt like fire inside my chest. My right side throbbed so violently that I thought I might lose consciousness before we even reached the doors. Robert parked quickly, straightened his tie as though preparing for a business meeting, and then opened my door with exaggerated patience. "Remember what I told you," he muttered. "You tripped, you fell. If you say otherwise, you will destroy your sister and bring disgrace on this family." His words pressed against my mind like a vice, but the agony in my body was stronger. I could barely walk, so he half guided and half shoved me into the emergency room. A triage nurse named Carla looked up, and her professional smile faltered when she saw me clutching my ribs. She asked what had happened, and Robert jumped in smoothly with his rehearsed story. My daughter tripped on the stairs, rushing to answer the phone, fell against a chair, and hurt herself. Carla's eyes narrowed, but she looked at me, not him, and asked me to rate my pain. 8. I whispered, my voice cracking. She nodded, wrote notes, and said I would need x-rays immediately. Robert tried to follow, but Carla's voice was firm as she said hospital policy required family members to wait outside until the patient was settled. For the first time since the attack, I was separated from my father's shadow, and relief washed over me, even as pain gnawed at every breath. The radiology technician Marcus helped me onto the table, careful as he positioned my torso. "Hold still," he said gently. "I know it hurts, but we need clear images." Each movement sent fresh agony, and I bit down hard to keep from crying out. After the first set of images, Marcus frowned slightly, then took several more from different angles. When he finished, he wheeled me back into an exam room, his expression unreadable. Minutes later, a doctor entered his badge reading Dr. Harris. He was in his 50s, with steady eyes and a calm presence that immediately made me feel seen. "Emily," he began, "I have reviewed your x-rays and I am concerned." He pulled up the images on the screen. "You have 3 fractured ribs on your right side, one of them a clean break. These fractures are not consistent with a simple fall." He traced the images with his pen, pointing out multiple impact points. "This pattern suggests direct blunt force trauma, not just tumbling downstairs." My breath caught and tears welled up. Robert's voice echoed in my mind, the warning, the threats. Dr. Harris lowered his voice. "Emily, hospital policy requires that I speak with you privately first. Is there anything you want to tell me about how this really happened?" My lips trembled. Outside the room, I could hear Robert demanding to be let in, his voice rising, but the nurse at the station firmly refused. For the first time in years, my father's control was blocked by rules he could not bend. The dam inside me cracked. My sister hit me with a chair. I whispered, my voice barely audible, and my father saw and did nothing. Dr. Harris nodded, his face grave but compassionate. "Thank you for telling me the truth. I need you to understand I am a mandated reporter. That means I am legally required to report suspected abuse to the authorities." He paused, watching my face as panic flickered through me. "Your safety and medical care are my priority, not your father's anger. We will have a social worker speak with you and the police will be contacted." My stomach twisted with fear. "My father is a lawyer," I stammered. "He will be furious." Dr. Harris's eyes held mine steadily. "Let him be furious. The evidence is here plain as day. You are injured in a way that cannot be explained away." He placed a hand gently on the rail of my bed. "You are not alone anymore, Emily." Relief mingled with terror. For so long I had carried the burden of silence, convinced no one would ever believe me. Now, with images glowing on the screen and a doctor standing firmly in my corner, the truth had weight. It could not be denied, not this time. A nurse administered pain medication, and slowly the edges of the agony dulled. Dr. Harris returned with a woman named Ms. Lawrence, a social worker with kind eyes and a calm voice. She sat beside me, notebook in hand, and asked me to tell her everything. At first, my voice shook, but as she listened without judgment, the words poured out. I described years of Veronica's cruelty every time my parents had excused it, every scar buried under the word accident. Ms. Lawrence took notes, nodding gently, telling me I had been living in a cycle of abuse. "This is not normal sibling fighting," she said. "This is domestic violence, and you deserve to be safe." Outside the room, Robert's voice rose again, arguing with security. His fury could not stop the truth this time. "As Ms. Lawrence explained restraining orders, police reports, and support services, I realized the impossible had happened. I was being believed. The X-rays had spoken when I no longer had the strength, and the evidence had shattered my father's smirk. For the first time in my life, I felt the possibility of escape. The morning after the hospital visit, I woke in a haze of medication and pain. My ribs were wrapped tightly, my wrist supported by a brace, and every small movement reminded me of the violence that had brought me there. Yet even as I tried to breathe through the discomfort, my phone vibrated with messages from Margaret. The first one read, "This has gone far enough, Emily. Come home so we can sort this out as a family." Another followed minutes later. "You are overreacting. The police questioning us was humiliating. Think of your sister's future." Her words stung, but they were predictable. What I did not expect was the call that came from Robert later that afternoon. His voice was sharp, his patience thin. "You need to drop this nonsense immediately. I have already spoken to colleagues," he said, "and they assure me these kinds of cases rarely hold up in court. All you are doing is dragging our name through the mud. You will destroy your sister's life, and in the process, you will ruin your own." I tried to tell him that my ribs were broken, that this was not just an accident, but he cut me off. "Accidents happen. What you are doing is deliberate. You are trying to humiliate us." His words echoed the smirk he had worn while I lay broken on the floor. He had never seen me as his daughter, only as a threat to the image he valued more than truth. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. Margaret called daily, sometimes in tears, sometimes with cold fury. One moment she begged me to forgive Veronica, claiming she had only lost control because of heartbreak. The next, she accused me of betrayal, hissing that no decent daughter would expose her family to scandal. Calls came from relatives I had not heard from in years. My grandmother phoned from Florida, her voice quivering as she pleaded, "Emily, please do not do this. Family is everything. Think of how ashamed your parents are." An aunt sent a message reminding me of how generous Robert and Margaret had been, insisting I owed them loyalty. Family friends left voicemails filled with concern but laced with judgment. "We are all so worried about you, Emily. Your parents have done so much. Surely you can work this out privately." Each word was another stone pressing against my chest, not only from injury, but from the crushing weight of manipulation. My car, still under Robert's name, was suddenly reported stolen. I had to return it and was left without transportation. My personal belongings at the house became hostages, with Margaret refusing to allow Sophie to collect them for me. Even my phone service was cut off when Robert removed me from the family plan. They were trying to isolate me, strip away every support, force me back into silence. Sophie became my lifeline. She drove me to appointments, helped me get a new phone, and sat with me during sleepless nights when panic attacks clawed at my chest. "They want you to doubt yourself," she said firmly one night as I sobbed into her couch. "They want you to believe you are wrong so you will drop the case. But what happens next time Veronica loses her temper? You might not survive." Her words chilled me but also anchored me. I thought of the chair crashing into my ribs, of Robert's smirk, of Margaret's whispered accident, and I knew Sophie was right. Still, the intimidation grew worse. Margaret began spreading rumors through her social circles, suggesting I was unstable, that grief over losing my job had clouded my judgment. At her garden club meeting, she told acquaintances she feared for my mental health. The whispers reached me, each one meant to undermine my credibility. Robert used his legal connections to delay proceedings, filing motions and continuances to stretch the process out. It felt like drowning slowly in a sea of manipulation. There were moments when despair nearly won. I would wake in the night gasping for breath, convinced I was falling again, the sound of the chair striking my ribs replaying endlessly in my mind. My body healed slowly, but my spirit wavered. Sophie reminded me again and again that this was their pattern: to deny, to control, to silence. She promised me I was not alone. My lawyer, Catherine Wilson, confirmed what Sophie said. "This is textbook," she told me. "They are trying to isolate and intimidate you. That means your case has power, otherwise they would not fight so hard." But the emotional toll was heavy. My grandmother cried that I was tearing the family apart. My mother accused me of being melodramatic, of exaggerating like I always did. Robert threatened that I would regret it if I dared to testify. Yet for the first time, I had people outside the family standing firmly with me. Dr. Harris and Ms. Lawrence had filed their reports. The prosecutor, Jennifer Williams, believed in the evidence. Sophie never wavered. These anchors kept me afloat as the storm of my family's pushback raged. Still, every day felt like a battle. Margaret left a voicemail one evening that crystallized their mindset. She said, "Emily, we took you back in when you had nowhere else to go. We gave you everything. How could you do this to us? It was always about what I owed them, never about what they had done to me." I realized with clarity that their love had always been conditional, tied to silence and submission. Now that I had broken that rule, I was no longer a daughter in their eyes, but a traitor. The realization hurt, but it also freed me. For once, I could see the pattern clearly. Their control only worked if I agreed to carry the guilt, and I was done carrying it. The day of the first court hearing arrived with a heaviness that pressed down on me like the weight of the chair that had broken my ribs. Sophie helped me dress carefully in a simple navy blouse and black skirt that would not draw attention but would make me appear steady and composed. Every movement sent sparks of pain through my ribs, though they were healing, yet the deeper ache came from knowing I was about to face my entire family in a setting where truth and lies would collide under oath. As we entered the courthouse, the echo of our steps on the marble floor made my heart race. The air smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, and everything about the tall columns and heavy doors reminded me this was not just another confrontation at home. This was the place where justice could either be affirmed or denied. Catherine Wilson met me near the courtroom doors, her calm confidence wrapping around me like armor. She adjusted her glasses and spoke softly. "Remember, Emily, you are not on trial. Your father will try to twist this into something it is not, but the evidence is strong. The X-rays do not lie. The medical report is clear. You must simply speak the truth." I nodded, my hands trembling as I gripped Sophie's arm. When the bailiff called our case, we walked into the room. Veronica sat at the defense table, her posture slouched as if she were the true victim. Her hair was styled immaculately, her dress pristine, but her eyes flickered with defiance when they met mine. Robert sat beside her, whispering furiously to his legal team. Margaret sat behind them in the gallery, clutching a tissue, her face arranged into an expression of tragic sorrow, as though she were a mother enduring unfair accusations. My stomach twisted. The prosecutor, Jennifer Williams, opened with a calm but powerful statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about accountability within a family that believed they could keep violence hidden behind closed doors. You will hear evidence that Emily Carter's ribs were broken not by accident, but by the deliberate act of her sister Veronica Carter, while her father Robert Carter not only failed to protect her, but sought to silence her. We ask you to listen carefully because the truth is written in her body and in the evidence before you." Then Robert rose to give his opening. His tone was smooth, rehearsed, dripping with indignation. "My daughter Emily has always been fragile," he said, prone to dramatics and exaggerations. "What happened that evening was an unfortunate fall, nothing more. For her to twist it into some kind of malicious assault is both cruel and absurd. My other daughter, Veronica, is a hard-working, kind young woman whose life is being torn apart by this baseless accusation." He turned to the jury, his voice lowering to a somber tone. "Families argue. Families fight. But to drag your own blood into a courtroom to seek to destroy them publicly, that is something no decent person should do. My jaw tightened. He was turning the truth inside out, casting me as the destroyer while shielding the hand that had struck me. When it was my turn to testify, my body trembled as I walked to the witness stand. I swore to tell the truth, my voice barely audible. But when I sat down and looked out across the room, I saw Sophie in the gallery, her eyes steady on me. That gave me strength. Jennifer led me gently through the questions. I described the evening in detail, every step, every word Veronica had shouted before she swung the chair, the crack of my ribs, the smirk on Robert's face. I spoke of Margaret whispering accident, of Robert ordering me to stay silent, of the rehearsed story he forced me to repeat. The courtroom was silent except for my voice, and though my words shook, they carried the weight of lived pain. Robert Cross examined me himself. He paced slowly, projecting authority, and asked with mock sympathy, "Emily, isn't it true that you were rushing to answer the phone that evening? Isn't it true that you have a history of clumsiness?" I held my ground. "No," I said firmly. "I was not rushing. I was attacked." He narrowed his eyes and pressed further. "You expect this jury to believe that your sister, who has no history of violence, suddenly picked up a chair and broke your ribs?" I met his gaze. "Yes, because that is exactly what happened." The jury leaned forward, some frowning, some scribbling notes. Dr. Harris testified next, displaying the x-rays and explaining in clear professional terms why the injuries were consistent with a direct blow from an object like a chair. "These fractures are not consistent with a fall," he said firmly. "In my decades of practice, I can distinguish between accidental injuries and inflicted ones. These were inflicted. Ms." Lawrence followed, recounting my statements at the hospital, her professional assessment that I was a victim of domestic violence, not a clumsy accident. She described how my story was consistent, how my fear of Robert's control was obvious, how the medical evidence backed everything I had told her. Margaret testified for the defense, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. She insisted she had seen me fall, that Veronica had not touched me. She wept, as she said I was confused, that grief and stress had clouded my mind. But when Jennifer asked her directly why she had told hospital staff that I had fallen, rather than letting me speak, Margaret faltered. She dabbed her eyes and muttered, "I was just trying to keep the family together." Veronica's testimony was colder. She looked directly at the jury and claimed she had never touched me, that I had tripped on the rug, that she had tried to help me, but I had lashed out in confusion. She painted herself as a sister burdened by my accusations, her life unfairly upended. But under cross-examination, her tone cracked. Jennifer asked Veronica, "Can you explain how 3 ribs break from a simple stumble?" Veronica hesitated, her lips twitching, her eyes darting to Robert. Her silence stretched uncomfortably until the judge ordered her to answer. "I don't know," she snapped finally. "People get hurt in accidents all the time." The courtroom shifted with uneasy murmurs. The climax came when Jennifer played the security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera across the street. Though it did not capture the strike itself, the audio clearly recorded shouting the scrape of furniture and my cry of pain, followed by Veronica's words. "You always wanted attention. Now you have it." The sound of my father's voice followed, low and commanding. "You will not speak of this outside these walls. Do you understand me?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The jury stared, some with widened eyes, others shaking their heads. Robert's face drained of color. Veronica's hands twisted in her lap. Margaret covered her mouth with her handkerchief, eyes darting around as if seeking an escape. In that moment, the fortress of denial they had built cracked open for everyone to see. Jennifer closed her case with calm certainty. The truth has spoken louder than the lies. This was not an accident. This was violence, and it was met with silence and complicity from those who should have protected Emily. Justice demands accountability. As I stepped down from the witness stand, my knees weak, I realized the courtroom had become the place where the smirk on my father's face was finally exposed for what it was, not authority, not control, but cowardice under the light of truth. The final day of the trial arrived with a tension that buzzed through the courthouse like static in the air before a storm. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Catherine at my side, my palms sweating against the polished wood. Across from me, Veronica twisted her hands nervously, her nails clicking against one another as though even she knew the walls of denial were crumbling. Robert sat upright, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the judge with an intensity that radiated desperation. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a tissue, careful to maintain the image of a sorrowful mother, though every now and then her mask slipped and a flicker of anger crossed her face. The jury filed in, their expressions guarded, and I could feel my pulse racing. This was the moment when all the manipulation, all the pressure, all the years of being silenced would either be upheld by truth or erased by doubt. Judge Miller's voice filled the room as he instructed the bailiff to read the verdict. On the charge of aggravated assault, the jury finds the defendant, Veronica Carter, guilty. My breath caught. The room erupted in gasps. Margaret let out a wail, clutching her pearls dramatically while Robert's lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Veronica's eyes widened, her face draining of color, and for the first time I saw not defiance, but fear flicker in her expression. But the bailiff continued. On the charge of obstruction and intimidation, the jury finds Robert Carter guilty. The words echoed like thunder rolling through the courtroom with undeniable power. My father's composure cracked, his hands gripping the table as though it might anchor him against the tidal wave of consequences that had finally reached him. A murmur rippled through the spectators, some shaking their heads, others whispering that it was about time someone stood up to him. Judge Miller called for order, his gavel striking firmly. Sentencing would come at a later date, but the verdict itself was the victory I had dreamed of and feared might never come. My chest felt lighter than it had in years, though the ache of my healing ribs still pulsed with every breath. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. For a moment, I hesitated. Speaking out had always been twisted against me, used as proof of melodrama, but now the truth had been validated in open court. Catherine touched my arm gently. You do not have to say anything, she reminded me. But I looked at Sophie, who stood beaming proudly at my side, and I knew silence was no longer my burden. I stepped forward. My voice shook at first, but it grew stronger as I spoke. For years, my family taught me to stay silent, to cover bruises with lies, to carry shame that was never mine. Today, a jury said the truth matters more than power, that silence will not protect abusers. If you are watching this and you feel trapped in your own home, please know you are not alone. There are people who will believe you, people who will stand by you even if your own family does not. The crowd hushed as I spoke, their pens scribbling, their cameras recording every word. Margaret's sobs behind me rang hollow against the clarity of the verdict. Robert stormed past the reporters without speaking, his face tight with rage, while Veronica was escorted in handcuffs, her tears smudging her carefully painted makeup. The public had witnessed what they had always tried to hide. Their control relied on shadows, but under the light, it disintegrated. That evening, news outlets ran the story headlines flashing across screens: local attorney convicted in domestic violence cover-up. Family courtroom drama ends in guilty verdicts. My father's smirk, once his weapon of control, was now displayed across television screens as the expression of a man exposed. In town, people whispered not about me as the liar they had painted, but about the arrogance of Robert Carter, thinking he could bend the truth forever. At Sophie's house, I watched the coverage, my hand trembling as she handed me a mug of tea. You did it, she whispered, tears in her eyes. You stood up to them and the world saw. The victory was not only legal, it was public. They had tried to brand me as unstable, disloyal, dramatic, but now it was they who bore the brand of guilt, their reputations stripped, their lies shattered. The community that had once been their shield now looked at them with disgust. Parents at Margaret's social clubs whispered behind her back. Clients dropped Robert's firm. Veronica's so-called friends vanished, unwilling to be associated with her. For so long I had dreamed of this moment, but the reality was more powerful than I had imagined. It was not about revenge in the petty sense. It was about truth being louder than denial, about justice carrying weight where family bonds had failed. At night, as I lay in bed at Sophie's guest room, my ribs still aching, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I was not defined by their cruelty. The courtroom had given me something I never thought possible: the final word. My father had smirked when I lay broken, convinced his authority could silence me forever. but it was the courtroom that had silenced him, exposing him for all to see. That public revelation was my revenge, not because I sought to humiliate them, but because I had chosen to stand to speak, to refuse to be crushed. And in doing so, I had turned their power into their undoing. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the consequences for my family unfolded like a series of dominoes that Robert had spent years carefully stacking, only to see them collapse one after another. Robert was suspended from practicing law almost immediately, and within a month, the state bar began formal disbarment proceedings. His name, once spoken with respect in the county courthouse, became a warning about arrogance and corruption. Clients abandoned his firm in droves, and partners who had once praised his brilliance now distanced themselves, whispering that they had long suspected something was rotten. For the first time in my life, I saw fear etched across his face when he left the courthouse after a mandatory hearing, photographers swarming headlines calling him a disgraced attorney. He who had smirked at my pain now had no mask to hide behind. Veronica was sentenced to time in county jail along with mandatory counseling. When she was escorted away in handcuffs, she screamed that I had ruined her life, but her words no longer held power. The jury had stripped away her facade, leaving her bare to the world as the sister who had chosen violence over love. Margaret withdrew into herself, ashamed and furious. The garden club where she once held court quietly removed her from leadership. Neighbors who once admired her perfect roses now crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. She called me several times, her voice breaking, blaming me for destroying the family name. Each time I told her calmly, "Margaret, you destroyed it yourselves. I only told the truth." Eventually, she stopped calling. My grandmother wrote one letter begging me to reconsider, to reconcile, but when I replied with a copy of the court transcript and photographs of my x-rays, she fell silent too. For the first time, the guilt that had haunted me began to lift. Sophie remained by my side, reminding me that the silence I had carried for years was never mine to bear. Together, we celebrated small victories. Buying my own phone plan felt like reclaiming freedom. Signing a lease on a tiny apartment filled me with pride, even if the space was modest. I began attending support groups for survivors of domestic violence, where women and men shared stories of pain and courage. In their eyes, I saw reflections of my own struggle, and in their voices, I heard echoes of the strength I had fought to find. Slowly, I rebuilt not only my life but my sense of self. At work, my colleagues treated me with quiet respect, no longer questioning my reliability but recognizing the resilience it had taken to endure. One afternoon after a meeting, a coworker approached me and whispered, "I watched the trial. You gave me courage to finally leave my own situation." Her words reminded me that my fight was not only for myself but for countless others who believed silence was their only option. The public nature of the trial had stripped away the family's power, but it also gave others hope that truth could prevail. The local paper even ran an editorial praising the courage of survivors who spoke out against abusers no matter their social standing. For Robert and Margaret, the isolation grew. Friends who once flocked to their dinner parties turned their backs. The Carter estate, once filled with laughter and wine glasses clinking, stood dark and empty. Veronica's release from jail months later was quiet, with no one waiting outside. I heard she struggled to find work, her reputation shattered. Though I no longer hated her, I did not forgive her either. Forgiveness was not owed, especially when remorse never came. Instead, I focused on moving forward. In time, I enrolled in evening classes to pursue a certification that had long been a dream. Each step forward was a declaration that I was no longer defined by their violence or control. On the anniversary of the verdict, I stood outside the courthouse, the same steps where reporters had once swarmed. The building gleamed in the sun, solid and unyielding, a reminder that justice, though imperfect, had been possible. Sophie joined me, her hand slipping into mine. "You changed everything," she whispered. "Not just for yourself, for them too." She was right. Robert's smirk was gone from the world, replaced by the image of a man undone by his own cruelty. Margaret's lies no longer silenced anyone. Veronica's violence no longer lived in the shadows. The resolution was not a fairy tale, but it was justice. Their downfall was public, their shame undeniable, and my voice had finally been heard. As I walked away from the courthouse, I breathed deeply, the ache in my ribs, only a faint memory now. The future stretched before me not as something to fear, but as something I could shape with my own hands. The consequences of their actions had freed me. For the first time in my life, I belonged not to their narrative, but to my own.